Hey, how's it going?
Great. So we're going to have our regular conversation, resume our regular conversation. I think we stopped in March.
Right, exactly.
Okay, you're a busy man. I got free time.
Okay,
So
we'll do this more often. It's fun.
okay, so the I have 2 points to discuss with you, and then we'll take your comments. The first one is that we should insist on scale transformation when it comes to diseases. Okay, that a doctor is very good at understanding the risks for one patient.
Right.
But when you're talking about the aggregate, the risk for a collective, it becomes very different. For example, if a patient has a certain disease, okay, that's uh, you can compute the probability, or you may miscompute the probability, but still, it's a problem that's very different from talking about collective, because then they cannot compare. They make mistakes of comparing deaths from COVID from death on the road, when deaths on the road are not contagious or slightly contagious if you want, but not seriously, whereas death from COVID are highly contagious. So if my neighbor dies on the road, odds are my probability of dying on the road has not changed. But if my neighbor dies of COVID, the probability of my having COVID increases. So when we deal with, and the way we do it is using extreme value theory. If in other words, if you disappear from Earth for 1 year to go work on your next textbook, no contact, okay, and come back from whatever planet you're on, and upon arrival they tell you, well, 1 billion people died. You know that billion people did not die of car accidents or all these space of risks. That these billion people died of only the most likely causes are wars and pandemics, not pretty much. Okay, so that's how. So that's my first point.
Should
Go
I
ahead.
respond to that one and then we'll go to the second one?
Let me make them both, and then okay.
Okay.
My second point is evidence-based. What people call evidence-based is usually not scientific. It's not evidence-based. Evidence is not necessarily evidence when it's an anecdote. It's more like they should rename it anecdote-based science, not evidence-based science, because evidence requires some statistical significance that is often not met by these. And science is not about also predicting. Science is about understanding the properties of something, which can or cannot be met with naive prediction, because sometimes these predictions can be just anecdotes. So I'm done with my 2 points.
Let me add a couple of things and then we can go back. So on the first one, the other part of it is dynamics. So scale in a pandemic happens over time. And so it's not just what happens once. And we know this, right? Because the fact that what you look at one person is sick, and the fact that it has larger consequences has to do with contagion, which happens over time. So you have to not only think about the patient himself, and you have to think about the community, but you have to think about over time, because it spreads over time. And thinking over time about what's happening now. Let's compare the number of cases we have of this now versus the number of cases we have of this now. It doesn't reflect the fact that indeed, over time, one case can turn into 1 million cases versus the other case is not going to. So it's both the understanding of individual versus collective, but also understanding time. And
yeah, this is okay. It's quite interesting what you're saying, because in the beginning of Skin in the Game, I said I'm taking the world as it is and the analysis as they are, and adding time and dynamics, and effectively they're the same thing.
yeah, well, time, yeah, is how we understand.
Sorry, not time and dynamics. Sorry, scale and dynamics, and
Scale and
effectively.
dynamics, right? Scale and dynamics, both related to each other, of course. But I have an example, and a kind of statement about it is that we see doctors that are treating a patient, or they know about a patient, and they send them home to infect their families. How can we do that? And
No.
part of this is the psychology. Part of this is the psychology of the separation of responsibility. A doctor has a patient walking into their office. They're responsible for what happens in the office and to that patient. A patient comes into a hospital. They're responsible for what happens in the hospital. But send them home, it's a community. There's no connection between that what's going on in the hospital or in the doctor's office and what happens in the community or in the home of the person, which is a very strong way to say it, but otherwise, how can you understand that you would send someone home and the result of that is going to be to infect their family?
Yeah, okay. This is classical problem of expert thing, because people are totally incapable of getting the expert problem. That expertise is something that should be treated a lot more delicately, and it comes back to macro and micro.
Right.
Micro expertise typically isn't expertise. Like a plumber has a micro expertise, but plumbers cannot make claims on the general plumbing
System.
and the thing.
Right.
And the second point we'll make there is you and I. So this is what I'm saying now is present in the last paper we wrote together. But in the first paper we wrote together on precautionary approaches to things, we discussed the carpenter fallacy. And the carpenter fallacy, can you describe it? I mean, it's like
well, the carpenter fallacy is that a carpenter will understand something made, what the uses of something made out of wood.
yes.
Right. If you know how to make something out of wood, does it mean that you understand, say in the example is a roulette wheel, right? How do you understand the probabilities of a roulette wheel if you know how to make something out of wood, i.e. the roulette wheel? It's not the same thing. That's obvious.
Exactly. And it was meant to say that probabilistic knowledge is rarely derived from micro expertise.
That's right.
Okay, so sequences and ruin problems, they're entirely, and then the interesting thing is the more you go collective, the more the problem becomes probabilistic. Now you may not agree fully because your approach is different. My approach is entirely probabilistic.
Right, I know, but in the case of a pandemic, it's actually also dynamic. So it shows us that dynamics plays a role in the context of large-scale things as well as fine-scale things. It's just, when does it show up?
Exactly. So, yeah. So I'm saying that you can approach it with dynamics, or I can approach it like my methods. I stick to my probability approach, which is by looking at a slice of time or slices of scale, by saying how things can be different because you're not meeting some independence criteria. Right. A bunch of independence criteria that are required for law of large numbers to operate.
Yeah, and I turn it a little bit around the other way. And what I do is I do the probabilities of time histories. So you have dynamics, and then you have a probability of a certain dynamics, which is a little different way of thinking about it.
Okay.
So let's talk about the second one. And remind me, the second one was about, what did you say?
Anecdote-based science.
Anecdote-based science. So there are a couple of things that I have to say about it, because one of the key things that we've been talking about is how do you understand things when you don't have a lot of data? Because like you have a new disease, you don't have a lot of data. How do you think about it? And so that creates a challenge for statistics-based, quote, evidence-based science when you have to make decisions. And so this is about decisions under uncertainty, which is something we both care about very much. And what do you do when you don't have information? How do you think about what's going on? But recently, I've really realized that there is a missing part that you understand very well, but somehow, it's really strange for me that others are not really clear about this, which is it's super important what you assume is your reference for what you're doing. We call it the null hypothesis in technical terminology. So the point is, you kind of have a model for what's happening in the world. And this model for what's happening in the world is your starting point for thinking about everything that happens. And it's very interesting that there are two different models that have been used for thinking about the coronavirus as an example. One is in the Far East, they had SARS, a little bit in Canada also. And they use the SARS as a model for thinking about the disease. Whereas in the West, the kind of common disease that we know about that's a terrible disease normally is the flu. So everyone is trying to think about it in terms of the flu. If you say, it's going to be the flu unless you prove to me that it's not the flu, it's very different than you say, it's SARS, and you have to prove to me that it's not like SARS. As it turns out, I think the SARS idea is a big advantage because, in fact, the two diseases are very closely related. In fact, the coronavirus is SARS-CoV coronavirus 2 because, in fact, their mechanism, how they cause disease is very similar, and how they transmit is very similar, and all kinds of things like that. So one of the problems is this idea of the null hypothesis. So, but one of the things that I've seen over and over again is when I try to understand why people who are, quote, evidence-based are really wrong about how they're thinking about the problem altogether, is they assume a particular reference point, and they then say, okay, now you've got to prove to me that it's
there are other problems evidence-based aside from that one, and it's pretty much a functioning of law of large numbers. Like, for example, if you have a large deviation, then n of 1 is sufficient. If you have a lot of regular event, an n of a million sometimes is not under fat tails. So that's what's important.
absolutely.
So, yeah. So for example, and this translates into prediction, because in physics, where your variance is very low and distributions are very thin-tailed, okay, a single prediction, right, would be sufficient, because if it doesn't come true, it means you don't understand the process. Whereas when you talk about fat-tailed mechanisms, you need a million predictions, you see, to figure out, to capture what you know. So this is why all this naive predictive analytics and stuff like that, it breaks down under fat tails.
Right. So
all of these come back to the workings of a law of large numbers. That's my last book. I would have showed it if someone stole it from my library. Is what happened.
So I want to say something about that, because there is this concept that I really feel is kind of missing, and that's the concept of the space of possibilities. So fat tails are that you have a space of possibilities that extends very far away from any reference that you start from. And
exactly.
The common events, the events that are common, you have to be aware that there are events that are very different. And more generally, you can have systems where you have events over here and events over there, and you have two different kinds of events. And when we think about diseases, it's even more sophisticated, which is that we have the flu, we have the coronavirus or the SARS, we have the hepatitis, we have HIV, we have all kinds of viruses. And when you think only in terms of one model, you don't realize that there are all of these different things that can happen. So the right way to think about diseases is actually not even just to think about, you know, SARS and flu, but actually to think about, hey, you know, there are 20, 30, 40 diseases that we know about. And look at all the different things that they can cause. And in particular, not just the ones that we have left over after we've vaccinated away everything that is really harmful, but think about the ones that are even more harmful that we've gotten rid of, because a new disease, and this is what we're really finding, a new disease is going to be much more like the diseases that we've gotten rid of because we were so affected by them that they caused so much harm that we spent decades making sure that they wouldn't be around.
All right, so now it's your turn. Go ahead.
So one of the things that we might talk about a little bit is what we've learned. And just to be a little bit clear about it, what we've learned is what we were warning about up front. In our original paper, we said, we don't know exactly what's going to happen with this disease, but it's going to be worse, or it can be much worse.
So let me make a statement I discovered about precaution before I forget.
That's right.
A precautionary approach is an approach that has the maximum amount, okay, the minimum amount of ex post regret.
Right.
So in other words, you take a decision and you take the one today that later on you regret the least.
Yeah.
There are problems, technical problems, let's not get into ergodicity where this is required. Okay, and the difference between our approach and others, or at least between my approach so we started thinking uncertainty was huge in the beginning,
Right.
and reducing it.
Right.
Whereas others doing the stupid hypothesis testing, what I call fortune cookie evidence-based methods, they went the other direction.
Right.
They
They
started
started assuming that they knew what is going on.
they assumed, and then
And
they
prove
say,
it to
oh
them
no,
that it's
no,
different
oh
from
no,
what they
oh,
think they know
morbidities are
all along.
high, or this, or discovering things. So we acted the way. This is why our way of our approach is vastly more robust. We got nothing to regret.
Right. And here is the thing, and you mentioned ergodicity or non-ergodicity when things are not reversible. We have non-reversible effects of this disease. And death is clearly a non-reversible effect, but what we've learned is that despite the fact that early on people said, hey, 80% of these cases are mild and these people are recovering and so on, it's not at all the case. What we find is that somewhere around 50%, 20% to 80% is a range of all cases have very, very severe effects, including heart damage, where the tissue of the heart, the muscle fibers are being cut by the virus, actually, and the cells are being enucleated. The nucleus is leaving the cell.
So we cannot really figure out what's going on till you make people who recover from mild cases of COVID run marathons.
That's right, but it's not even that. They can't even get out of bed and go to their desks. They can't do work.
So we have to count the morbidity. So the whole idea is, when we started our paper, we said we had so the best decision is a decision that's never really wrong. Okay, in that sense, given the structure of uncertainty, is by saying, okay, we're going to consider that they are morbidities we know nothing about.
That's right.
Unless we know otherwise, and as time progressed, effectively these started showing up and scaring others. They
That's
did
right.
not.
In the meantime,
I'm more optimistic today than I was on day one in January, when most people are more pessimistic today than they were on day one.
Right. Yeah. Right. It could have been even worse, but what we know about is surely bad enough. And
I don't know. I mean, I'm more.
other people were expecting.
So now your points on. So you want to address vaccines and.
Let me just finish this one more. I want to say two more things that are going on that we found out just really in the last few weeks. So one is the heart damage, which, as far as the people who are experts, is permanent. And in fact, if you think about it, you tear parts of the heart, it can tear itself apart as it's beating. And what we see is that people several months, and we don't only have several months after they had COVID, then the heart actually becomes a problem. So there's evidence that it may be tearing itself apart, which is horrendous. We don't know how bad it's going to get still.
For what? For about 20% of the population?
It's right now in the heart, the best information is about 50% actually.
Some damage, but maybe not perceptible or not.
In the meantime, it's damage that you know is there. And in fact, what happened is that someone took people who had died for pulmonary reasons, not from heart reasons. And they looked in their hearts and they saw that this damage was there. So that's pretty bad.
So in other words, we may have some reduction in some increase of mortality from morbidities that we're seeing today.
And disability. One of the things to know is that SARS, which remember should be the reference, they've done a 10-year follow-on study on the survivors. And many of them can't work 10 years later.
So there is a I mean, substantial, let's say, or worrisome rate of morbidities.
That's right. The other thing is the brain effects. The hippocampus and the hippocampus, which is the part that enables you to kind of walk around and navigate where you're going, that's damaged. And the other one is what's called the insulae, that they know there are several other parts. The insulae is responsible for emotions, and so it's a lot of psychological problems. So depression and panic and so on. And in fact, that's what's being reported by people who have what's called long COVID.
Okay. So this is not a trivial disease.
No, there's this thing called brain fog, where people can't think straight, and And the other thing, by the way, there are tens of thousands of people in Facebook groups talking about this.
Okay, so let's say till we get an idea of the rate of morbidity, okay, we have to be
One
cautious.
more I have to tell you.
Okay.
It seems that there is also an effect on male fertility. We don't
Yeah.
know again how much that's going to be
Now,
yet.
I don't understand how did Barabasi detect it from early in March, just simply from doing network
Oh,
analysis.
it's very straightforward, actually, in the context of knowing what the risks are. And that is because you look at where in the body the receptor, the ACE2 receptor, is expressed. And it's expressed in the lungs, we know that, in the intestines, but also in the heart and in the testes and in the brain. And there are several other places where it's expressed, but these are the places where you would look for harm because that's where the receptor is.
All right. Now that one point you had about vaccines, I guess we got a few minutes, 3-4 minutes.
So the vaccines point is they're now talking about using a vaccine before it's been extensively tested. And there's a good reason to think about doing that because, after all, this is a terrible disease and maybe we can stop it by using the vaccine. And if you didn't have any other way to stop it, then, maybe that would be a good risk. Now, we have other ways to stop it that, except for a vaccine, that might be better. And the reason why is that you test the vaccine progressively in larger numbers of people. Because just like feeding people, a new kind of plant that you don't know what's going to happen, vaccines can have bad side effects, including possibly the effect of actually making the disease worse rather than better, or having a reaction, some kind of immune reaction. It may happen immediately or it may happen a little bit later. We don't know. So the idea is to test it in larger and larger groups. Now, they're suggesting to start a vaccine that hasn't been tested extensively. And I can understand that it would be better to get rid of the disease. But so if we want to do that, why don't we use it on the smallest population that is going to have the biggest effect on the transmission of the disease? And so many people, in fact, probably most people at this point are taking a lot of precautions or are not, doing risky things. So why don't we take the people who are particularly doing risky things like not wearing masks, and we can vaccinate them, and then we'll really stop the disease because it's really.
If you can't get them to wear masks, I guess it's going to be tough to convince them.
So vaccination might be a good idea, and then they're taking the risk of the vaccine, and that would be a reasonable thing to do instead of having everyone be vaccinated because the other people are not taking the risks. In principle, they don't really need it and shouldn't be taking that risk. Does that make sense?
Again, it's if what's feasible, all right. But you
Right.
can't even get people to wear masks, in the South, and I'm sure the vaccines for them are like they'd rather have poison, cyanide, than vaccines. But again, I mean, if you can, but so let me ask you.
The people, then you can't do it. If you're vaccinating the people who are already taking precautions, that doesn't help.
No, it doesn't help, and assuming the precautions are sufficient, but also vaccination. Yeah, but you can also, given the risks of this, you can also vaccinate people who want to travel or want to do things that expose them to the virus, and they can calculate the risk and tell themselves, okay, what looks like the risk of the vaccine. Also, given the history of vaccines, because I assume that you can use the history of vaccines that went wrong.
Right.
See, and we know the history of vaccines that went wrong. We know how they went wrong. But one thing at the collective, at the individual, vaccines may be bad. At the collective level, something tells me that vaccines have much lower risk than the disease. Again, you can't do
right. It's hard to compare. It's a question of what is the alternative as well.
So for one person, they may be break even, but for the collective, it would be a huge payoff because the vaccine effectively it demultiplies whereas the other one multiplies.
Yeah, and then the question is,
local problem that is not contagious, versus unless the vaccine causes you to do contagious things or go on a rampage or become an economist and do harmful things to society or something like that. You see,
so I think that you're right, and I think that one of the things that's missing, and I really agree that this is missing, is a real assessment of risk versus benefit at the societal level For at what
Societal level, I think I
time?
see it's a no-brainer. Vaccines are better. At the
No, no,
individual
but
level,
the question is at what point in time, right? Do you wait for the test to be completed? That's the question, right? Do
okay.
you do it, do you wait
Yeah,
at 2 months or 3 months or 5 months or whatever it is until the next level test is completed, or do you do it before? And that requires the kind of analysis that is, as we said, is not part of the standard training.
yeah, exactly. When you say you do cost-benefit analysis for one, not for society. Now, another final question about testing. So aside from, I mean, you have your pet idea about scan test, but um,
It's not a
we're
bad idea. It
calculating
really
with
is very powerful, but yes, the
we
CT
don't get
scans.
the results using cellular automata doing simulations of what happens if you have a bad test, and you can define a bad test as something that has a very high false negative rate.
Right.
Okay. And that, which is a high false positive rate, is not a big deal, as a big deal. And then you can compute what it does, and effectively it does wonders. Even a bad test works because plus, if you have a correlation between false negative and how infectious a person is.
Right, but it depends. So the details here matter, right? So if you use the test and you say to people, which some people are saying, hey, you can take this test and then you can go out and party, that's not going to work because the transmission is still going to be larger than one, and then you're going to have Zoom. It's going to go up just,
Yeah,
it's go up a little bit slower.
the fact is, you need to know what rate, and what both false negative rate and what
That's
rate
right.
and
So
what rate of testing you need to bring your R0 below 1.
right. So the point is that let's say you use this test in addition to things that are already doing a fairly good job, like R is already 1, and then you add another testing to it, and then you reduce R. And now you have a decline and you can get to 0, and that's great. That's super important, and that solves the problem.
Yeah.
And
What happens is there's a compounding effect. We've discussed before the mask situation. If I wear a mask and you wear a mask, all right, the benefit is squared.
right,
Like my mask is effective 50%, use 50%, total 75%. It's the same thing with testing plus mask. Like, for example, case study, skin in a game. Next week, I'm going to the Eastern Mediterranean, to the Republic of Phoenicia, right, which is the newly formed republic, and I'm gonna board a plane in New York. Everybody must be PCR negative within the last 72 hours. Okay. If you have that plus a mask, you see a compound, so you need the joint distribution.
right.
So
That's
that
really
plus
important.
mask, sorry.
There's a particular
Also,
use.
those who are probably contagious, okay, and have probably infected and have a false negative, there are probably going to be few on the plane,
Right.
maybe not.
By the way,
But let me continue. But those will not be likely to be infectious.
there's one problem with what you're saying, which is that there's a study that shows that in a plane where they were all using masks and there was only 1 or 2, whatever, people who were infected, there was someone else who was infected. Now, it may be low probability, but there was someone who was infected. So the key that they think is
No, but these plane rides within the United States, inside the United States, do not require a negative PCR.
yeah, the additional piece that I would add is it's risky to use the bathroom. So we have to figure out a way to make going to the bathroom in an airplane much safer.
It seems to me that the person did not have, I mean, the way I use it, I use a bathroom. I have 2 surgical masks, plus all kind of apparatus on top, plus sometimes N95 if I can handle. And it seems to me that if you, and don't stay, it's proportional to time.
Yeah.
Don't spend a lot of time in the bathroom.
Also, don't sit on the seat.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, it's, we have to be careful.
The point
But
is,
I have one more piece for you. I have one more piece for you before.
let me finish my sentence. If I tell you that these infections on planes happen on a population that was not PCR negative or assumed to be PCR negative.
Yeah, but in this case, they knew that there was a very low probability of someone being infectious, being infected. There was they found out. So the point is,
Anyway, New York, today,
very low probability.
in New York today, you have about 1 in 200 people, 1 in 150 people of those tested test positive. And to get tested, it's almost impossible unless you, you can't walk or something, unless you're traveling. Okay, so it seems to me that the odds of having someone infected in New York is reasonably low today.
Yeah, well, the problem is that they still have 600 cases per day. And the fact that they have 600 cases per day means that you can't open up restaurants in a normal way. You can't open up the schools in a normal way, or even maybe the way they're doing it.
Anyway, this will be another, if you want, debate.
Couldn't open up the schools, right? But I have one more piece to add, which is there is a challenge that we're facing, that these relatively low quality or low accuracy tests are super helpful for. And that is, if you get to zero, if you eliminate the disease, people are worried that you're going to have a new outbreak because someone is going to come in and do a new outbreak. So the key parameter there is, if you have someone that comes into the community and is contagious, how many cases will there be before you can stop it? And the answer is that depends upon the visibility. It depends on people being careful all the time. So the trick is that if you use these tests, that you have saliva tests that you can do on yourself, and you have a lot of people doing them, then you can detect when there's a small outbreak very early and stop it super fast. So the likelihood that you'll have a larger outbreak becomes very small.
If the test costs $1, that we can open the schools and test students every day?
No. Either you get it going down or you have it going up. If you have it going up, you have more cases and more cases. If you have it going down, then you get to zero and then you can open up the schools.
You don't think that testing, the act of systematic testing, would allow you to very quickly identify who in the population?
Right, but if you're quickly identifying who in the population has it, then by definition, you can stop it. So there's none of this stuff of we have the disease and we could do testing and do it. Either this is an multiplicative process, right? Either it's going to grow or it's going to shrink. If it's going to shrink, you get rid of it and you're done. Or if it's going to grow, you have more of it. So there's none of this idea that you can somehow keep testing and maintain it in the population. It doesn't really make sense to me because it's multiplicative.
Okay, so that will be the topic, hopefully, of our next debate. Try to work out the math here. And thanks, Yaneer. So we should do these more often, no?
Absolutely. I tell you, it's been a terrible time, thinking about all of the suffering and loss of life. But it's always a pleasure when we get together, which makes, doing something with people. And by the way, that's sort of general, right? We care about each other, and that's what makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, we care about society. We're not alone. And that's what people can't get. And this virus shows us how dependent we are on risks taken by others. Great. Thanks a lot. And incidentally, my background is nicer than yours.
It is, definitely. I really love it. I'm glad that I'm looking at it while you're looking at mine.
Books or something, or cooking instruments or something.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right.
Take care.
Thanks everyone. Bye. Have a good day. Bye.
Bye.